Hi everybody, as he said, my name is Jonathan Nichols, and here's how PSYOP actually works. We're also going to cover some of the most recent Russian PSYOP campaigns online. So, we'll start with a little bit about me. You can find me on the Twitter at WVUAlphaSoldier. I started out my career in PSYOP at the JFK Special Warfare Center in school in 2006. I was a tactical soldier in Iraq in 2008. I was the chief counter-propaganda analyst for United States Forces Iraq in 2010, that's right. I did atmospherics, which is PSYOP and human sort of mixed together in 2011. As a liaison officer to the PSYOP task force in Afghanistan in 2012. I switched over and did more cyber operations, starting at Flashpoint in 2013 to 2015. I've been a little bit of an independent security contractor doing some sort of odds and ends and interesting work since then. So let's start with definitions. PSYOP are planned operations to convey selected information and indicators to audiences. We try to influence emotions, motives, and objective reasoning with the ultimate goal of changing the behavior of those target audiences, be they governments, groups, or individuals sometimes. The mission statement for PSYOP is to persuade, change, and influence the hearts and minds of foreign nationals to meet U.S. objectives. I have had to say that so many times in my life, it's ingrained in my head. This is essentially how PSYOP works at a high level. This comes from the PSYOP leadership reference chart. Because it's the government and lowest bidder, they spelled reference incorrectly at the bottom. That's their typo, not mine. The way the 7-step PSYOP process works is we begin with our planning phase. This is where we take our understanding from SecDef and the president, which includes what our psychological objectives are, as well as our supporting psychological objectives, and we'll get into definitions here in a second, our potential target audience lists, and our measures of effect. We then move on to target audience analysis. This is where I figure out the specific details about each individual target audience that I'm going to be trying to influence during the operation. Then I develop my series using the series concept worksheet, and the series development worksheet. These are worksheets that help us work through, much like how McDonald's has a defined campaign, with I'm loving it being the campaign motto, and the golden arches maybe being the overriding indicator that lets the target audience know that they're being influenced towards those ends. We do much the same things in our operations. Then we go into our product design, which is just what it sounds like. We get approval, which doesn't matter for cyber operations that we're going to see when we're looking at the Russian stuff. Then we disseminate the data, the propaganda out there. Then we evaluate what we're doing. The biggest ones that we care about, I'll go over here. So in planning, the planning phase, phase 1, we care about the PSYOP objectives, again handed to us down from SecDef, the supporting PSYOP objectives, target audience, all the things I just said. It's not the right button. There it is. So definitions. The PSYOP objective is the psychological objective is the behavior that's supposed to be changed. So something very simple, like in Afghanistan or Iraq, we might say that we want to decrease violence in the area of operations. The supporting PSYOP objectives are what the target audience can do in order to achieve the PUB. So if we want the target audience to decrease violence, we want to see them refrain from acts of violence directed at security forces. We want them to stop committing acts of interethnic violence, which you see in Iraq and Afghanistan quite a bit. And these are literally taken from the field manual. And refrain from committing acts of criminal violence. What's that? Oh. All of these things, again, are taken directly from the PSYOP field manual, and I will have references at the end. But again, this stuff really isn't rocket science, right? You see that these are the specific actions that the target audience can take in order to demonstrate that they believe in the PSYOP objective. The target audience is any audience which is capable of doing the actions that we're talking about. Then we go into our target audience analysis. This was phase 2. This is the bread and butter of what it is to be a PSYOPer. This includes quite a bit of data here. I'm not going to go into all of it. But essentially, what we're trying to figure out are the conditions, vulnerabilities, and susceptibilities of the target audience to our messaging. So if your audience, so the conditions just detail every single thing that the target audience has going on in their life. The vulnerability are specific issues, specific characteristics, motives, or conditions that we would be able to use to affect the target audience behavior. So if we find that we're trying to decrease violence in an area that is with a lot of mothers in it, that might be a place where we would spend a lot of time targeting mothers that maybe their kids are getting affected by this violence. And these are just examples taken directly from the field manual. As you see over there, I've skipped over, but I have 5 more slides if anybody's willing or welcome to look at the specifics of what a target audience analysis worksheet looks like. Then we get into our series development. This is the phase of PSYOP, which helps us identify, again, the symbols we're going to be using, the main arguments we're going to be using, and the sort of the overarching themes that we're going to use. These are specific to each target audience and each action that we want them to do. So if we have a supporting PSYOP objective, in this case, we want the target audience to report groups of individuals involved in sectarian violence. We would then look at the different target audiences. In this case, we have Durrani males and Gilzai females. We identify which behaviors or which PSYOP products in which series of PSYOP products we are going to use. Package them in sort of an overall marketing theme, again with the same sort of iconography and the same sort of color schemes in each instance. And then develop a PSYOP campaign, essentially a marketing campaign, that uses those lines of persuasion, those arguments, those main arguments that we had against those specific target audiences, using the arguments that we've identified in the target audience analysis process. And you see in this specific instance, the PSYOPers have decided that they're going to target the Durrani females with PSYACs, which are specific actions taken against the target audience or with the target audience, handbills and newspaper articles. Whereas in Series B, we found that the Gilzai females don't really read newspapers, probably because they were illiterate. So we're going to do the PSYACs that we would anywhere, but then also radio interviews and TV commercials, because that was assessed in this instance to be most likely to reach the illiterate Gilzai female population. Now let's do it for real.
And what the objectives appear to be, first of which was to cast doubt or cause doubt in the minds of the public or the electorate. And then secondly, of course, was again this animus, personal animus Putin had towards Secretary Clinton. And then as things unfolded, because initially the Russians, I don't believe, took Trump seriously as a candidate, just like no one else did either. But as things transpired, and particularly when he became the Republican nominee, their focus kind of changed, I think, towards, even when the polls indicated that Secretary Clinton was going to win, they were focused kind of on how to undermine her potential presidency. And then when he became the nominee, you know, what could they do to favor him? Because clearly they would prefer him.
So right there we were just given 3 examples of the Russian PSYOP objectives. And this would come to us very much the same way it would come during a real operation, where someone high up in government, in this case I believe he was Director NSA, gives us what the adversary's psychological objective is. In the case of doing counter-propaganda, our mission is to try to reverse engineer the process that the adversary used. So we're going to collect all the data we can on what's going on. And this is the example of identifying these psychological objectives. In this case, he said the psychological objective 1 was to cast doubt on the US electoral process in the minds of the electorate. PSYOP objective 2 was to degrade electorate confidence in Hillary Clinton. And PSYOP objective 3 was to support Donald Trump. Now we can extrapolate from that some supporting PSYOP objectives. This took a little bit of reverse engineering where I went through each instance of Russian propaganda that I could find and identify how those messages supported those basic objectives. And I haven't gotten, the ones here that we're going to focus on are PSYOP objective 1, that was casting doubt on the US electoral process. Supporting objective 3, target audiences expresses distrust of the political rallies and protests. And PSYOP objective 4 for PO1, target audience conducts activity which is considered divisive to other Americans. We're also going to see them try to express dislike, try to get the target audience to express dislike for Hillary Clinton on social media, and express a preference for the rivals to Hillary Clinton on social media. And then, of course, we're going to see them want to have some support for Donald Trump. So the potential target audiences that we can identify here, at least in the beginning, are the US electorate and social media users. As we see, the Russians boiled this down into several other subgroups. The specific ones that we're going to look at are the LGBT community in support of Hillary Clinton and the Tea Party. Those are the two that we're going to look into. In this case, we'll start with the Series 1, which was LGBT United. This is a Russian series that was targeted at the LGBT community. These are two examples of Russian propaganda that were pulled straight from the Facebook, Google, and Twitter discussion with the the House Intelligence Committee. So we're just pulling these straight from official government sources. There'll be no speculation here. These are not me trying to figure out which Russians on Twitter were bots. This is something that we have official confirmation of. In one case, you see we have a Bernie Bros. Hero coloring book they're advertising. In the other case, we have an anti-Westboro Baptist Church message going on. This data actually came, thankfully, with metadata. So we were able to see exactly how much the Russians spent on it in terms of rubles, what the ad impressions were, number of clicks, and then most importantly for our target audience analysis process, we can actually see specifically how they targeted it. So on the instance on the right, you see that they specifically targeted the LGBT people who matched with interests for the LGBT community, Hillary Clinton, and same-sex marriage. In a message that doesn't have anything to do with any of that, they were specifically targeting the Westboro Baptist Church in their messaging. But the metadata suggests that they were actually focusing on a different target audience. So we can do our target audience analysis and reverse engineer what they were getting at. The psychological objective 1 that we already mentioned was to cast doubt on the US electoral process in the minds of the electorate. And objective 2, degrade electoral confidence in Hillary Clinton. Those were and those below are the supporting PSYOP objectives that we identified previously. The main argument was that the target audience should support Bernie Sanders and distrust protests, with several supporting arguments there. We can also do some basic measuring of effect at this stage in the operation because we can identify the number of clicks and impressions that these things had. Based on market research, an ideal number of clicks for a successful marketing campaign online is 0.05%. The specific campaign achieved 5,000 impressions with 300 clicks with a 0.06 click rate, making it an above average successful campaign. In this example, we have 3 Tea Party messages. I see that those might be difficult to read. So the first one discusses if anybody wants to help make America great again, and they want to see pictures of their kids on this account, they should take videos, pictures, and send them to #KidsForTrump. And that'll make your patriotic team of young supporters appear on the account. Okay, let's go down to the next one because the text is actually there. In the second text, you see that you see a picture of a kid shooting a weapon. This is the way our children have to be raised, not to promote violence, but it's to promote confidence and the ability to defend yourself. Follow us and post your video to make your kid proud. And the final one, we see that Florida goes Trump. Here are the Florida cities participating and several other additional details. Again, in this instance, we're able to see specifically who they targeted and how they targeted, which helps us to reverse engineer where this message was effective and where it may not have been. In this case, the target audience was the Tea Party. The current behavior for the target audience was that they supported Trump. The desired behavior from the Russians was for the target audience to continue to show support for Trump and to conduct divisive behavior that other people in the American population would dislike. The main argument, the TA should show support for Trump by posting pictures considered divisive to other Americans. In this particular instance, we find that the measure of effect was somewhat less effective. While they had a much wider audience with over 28,000 impressions, they only had about 1,000 clicks, which is a 0.003% click rate, and is considered to be relatively ineffective or below average as far as these things go. There are other possible measures of effect that we could use, and there's plenty more research to be done in this field. Hopefully I'll be a part of it. In our first supporting PSYOP objective, the target audience was supposed to cast doubt in the validity of the US electoral system. As we see here on the White House website, we have the White House itself stating that over there are 1,000 proven instances of voter fraud. Further down on the website, it goes into specific details that they feel demonstrate that there is a lack of confidence in the US electoral process. I would say in that case, they were somewhat effective. For SPO2, the target audience does not participate in the US election. Well, looking at the data from there, we find that 58% of eligible voters went to the polls. And that is, it's roughly the same turnout rate that we found in 2012. So in this case, this particular Russian PSYOP objective might not have been met to their standard. In the SPO3, where we saw that the Russians wanted the target audience to express a distrust of political rallies and protests, well, we've seen several times in recent history that the US population has come out to set record numbers just as recently as last weekend. So in this case, I would say again, the Russians maybe didn't meet their objectives. SPO4, target audience conducts activity which is considered divisive to other Americans. I think in this case, they probably succeeded in spades. We find that today Americans are more divided now than potentially they were since the Civil War. PO2, SPO1 was a dislike of Hillary Clinton on social media. I think anybody with a social media account can find multiple instances of this coming into their feed, whether they want it or not. So in this case, they appear to have been successful.
I think they're all lying to me.
That's true. Target audience was supposed to express a preference for rivals to Hillary Clinton on social media. I think, again, we all know a bunch of Sanders bros, and whether or not they were originally Clinton supporters that switched over. I think the percentages here, at least from the beginning of the campaign to how it finally ended, show that there was clearly a significant amount of support for Hillary Clinton. In this case, the Russians would probably be able to say that they succeeded in their operation. SPOs, these are the last ones, where the target audience expresses support for Donald Trump and expresses preferences for Trump on social media. Well, he won the election, and I'd say that it's fairly evident that they might have achieved some success there. These are the sources. These are the 3 PSYOP field manuals, affectionately called .301, .302, and 33 by themselves. And then the specific instances of Russian propaganda can be found on the Democrats' House Intelligence Committee website at the URL listed. And if anybody has any questions, sorry I go through my briefs pretty briefly, so there's probably some. Feel free to ask them now. Sure.
Do we know the Russians' reasoning for preferring Trump over Clinton?
Yeah, so in that interview with Clapper, there's a historic animosity between Hillary Clinton and President Putin. And that animosity stems back from, I think it goes as back as her time as First Lady, but definitely while she was Secretary of State, there was an immediate animosity between the two individuals. And since, as that interview with Clapper also states, Putin just has no love for her. And so even if he thought Hillary Clinton was going to win, and I think everybody did at the time, he was still attempting to disrupt and degrade her ability to govern effectively should she have won. Any more? I was expecting more. Sure.
Are there any reputable, non-government sponsored, I guess, like nonprofits or anything that are dedicated to trying to identify and call out like PSYOP campaigns as they happen?
Yes, the Hamilton, does anybody know the URL? Hamilton 7161. There's a website, you can just Google Russian propaganda and Hamilton. Mm-hmm. They're attempting to do a job at it. The DFR Labs, which is run by the Atlantic Council, is also doing a pretty good job at it. The hesitancy with that, and the reason why I didn't include any of their work on this slide deck, was that there is a tendency to lump in information that isn't directly sourced to Russia into the thing. So just because someone agrees with the Russian messaging does not make them Russian. I specifically sourced the two examples I gave in this presentation. Two things that we can definitively say were Russian, were funded by that government. So I'm hesitant to use those in any sort of official things, but as a broad overview, VFR labs in that Hamilton group are a good place to look. Did you have one?
No, I was just being smart.
Oh, okay. Anybody else?
I can make cricket noises for you.
Way in the back.
Ma'am?
Yes. Okay. Without making noises,
I wouldn't dream of it. This is recorded.
yeah. What exactly do you do? I mean, now I know that some of the stuff that they were putting out at least early on was obviously coming from their full farms and all that. Is there anything, are there any other things that are being done to figure out who these people are?
So in policy circles, that's sort of it, right? In policy circles, there's a huge discussion around how to do any sort of effective countering. And while there are plenty of SIGINT types of ways and human types of ways of figuring out which accounts are actually bona fide Russians, which are just Americans who happen to disagree with whatever it is or agree with the Russians. While that work is being done, the real challenges right now are at the policy level, trying to figure out how to balance the discussion between the First Amendment and the right to do this. So a lot of people, whether you be an Obama supporter or a Trump supporter, for instance, a lot of people on either side are going to be really nervous to see there be a ministry of propaganda identifying what is propaganda and taking it offline. And we're, say, most people in the government and most people who are advising the government on this are really hesitant to suggest that we create something like a Ministry of Information that will be the arbiter of what counts as a genuine grassroots message and what counts as Russian propaganda being spread by an American. That gets into some very slippery slope First Amendment territory that we're not sure would stand up at all. Countering it in terms of, there are technological ways to counter it, where we have infrastructure degradation, where maybe we would take down the Russian botnets, be it through public-private partnerships with Twitters and Facebooks of the world, or whether we would go ahead and attack the infrastructure as a state-on-state sort of action. Those there's a little bit less gray area in, and I feel like the government feels much more comfortable. And then there's the issue of counter-messaging. So typically in counter-propaganda, what we would do, we would identify, exactly as we did here, we identify the methods, the psychological objectives and supporting objectives that the Russians or any adversary are using to target a target audience. And then we would produce more compelling propaganda to combat that messaging. Now that's easy to do in Iraq or Afghanistan, where I'm talking about Gilzai females. I might be able to out-message the Taliban in influencing Gilzai females. But again, I have a real hesitancy, and there's an institutional hesitancy for the US to get involved in any level in messaging the population in this sort of a targeted propaganda sort of way. So the jury's still out on how exactly we're going to, we as a society are going to get around the First Amendment hurdles and get a good handle on how propaganda works when it's propaganda targeting our own citizens. Sir?
I mean, basically what it seems like you're describing is a propaganda arms race. Is there any international agreements or treaties or regulations that countries agree to regarding propaganda, or is it just a free-for-all?
We can lie to ourselves, or we can lie to them.
As far as I know, the answer is no. There are some level of international norms related to, I guess, what typically happens in historic propaganda is that if you as the disseminator of the propaganda are found to be a disingenuous, lying, whatever nation, then the target audience is less likely to, well, your adversary is quickly going to call that out. And such things you've seen with the U.S. messaging on how we treat our how we treat people that we capture, and then how the Taliban beat us over the head with it when Abu Ghraib came out, Al-Qaeda as well. Typically, if you turn out to be a jerk in doing propaganda, you will have a very tough time convincing the target audience in the end. And so the international norm has developed that you really try to avoid outright lying. This is why people don't trust the Taliban's measure of any sort of combat damage they do to US or NATO forces in Afghanistan, because they always overinflate their numbers and everybody knows this about them. Same thing where you see the US is losing a lot of ground on influence operations related to Abu Ghraib and how we treat prisoners. This is the type of, that's the sort of thing that, that sort of has been a check on itself in the international realm. Again, we haven't really focused too much on how we deal with it when we're dealing with non-combatants in each other's individual zones of influence. Ma'am?
I know that the Swedish and the French government started when they were having their elections, and they found that the Russians were interfering. They had people hunting down these lies and calling them out. I noticed that there were some really out there, like the pizza thing, that was coming apart with and some of that guy who got killed in the robbery, they tried to pin it on shutting him, the Clinton campaign shutting him up on some kind of work. To me, those were obviously just crap, okay? To a lot of other people, it wasn't, okay? How do you call it? I mean, is there anything government is doing to like hunt this stuff down, or can you hunt it down and then call it out?
So there are several differences between the way the U.S. operates and the way our allies over in other NATO countries do. The first thing I would say is that those guys have been dealing with domestic propaganda targeting their citizens for a lot longer than we have. That causes them to, or that has allowed them to develop much more of a media literacy around how to intelligently look at subjects than the Americans tend to be good at. In that line of thinking, our NATO allies regularly tell us in policy meetings that they want to see the U.S. develop media literacy programs and apply them in our academic institutions. The issue with that is the U.S. academic system is not designed the same way that our NATO allies are. Much of the role of the education system is devolved down to the state level. So for better or worse, the ability for individual states to influence the academic system has led to institutional resistance on how to limit the effect of this sort of bullshit when it hits their Twitter feeds. There was a third, but I lost it.
We're allowed to lie to ourselves.
Absolutely, yeah. Anybody else? Sir?
So there's a push right now, at least within the United States, to have social media companies like Twitter and Facebook to develop some sort of censorship capability. How do you see that working long term with gaining people's trust in order to push propaganda, that nation states will be able to use a censorship capability to win the hearts and minds?
Well, so long as so you don't have free speech on Twitter, you don't have free speech on Facebook. Those are private platforms. Those are not public spaces. So if you violate the terms of service of Facebook or Twitter, you'll get your account banned. I've had multiple. There's a reason why. There's several iterations of my Twitter handle. So you do So if the social media companies can self-regulate, then they take the burden off of us trying to figure out, us being the society, trying to figure out how we're going to conduct counter-propaganda in any legal way under the banner of the First Amendment. So again, so long as it stays within the domain of Twitter and Facebook, then that legal burden and that social burden is shifted from any major government organization and put on them.
What we see is kind of history repeating itself. Back in old country in Russia, once the state nation once Russia bought all the TV stations, forced all the independent stations out, the Russian citizenry started gaining trust in what was on TV. If it's on TV, I can trust it.
Right.
And so I see the same type of thing happening with Twitter and Facebook, where as they implement censorship capabilities, their users will naturally trust those systems, thereby opening the door for other nation states to run more successful PSYOP campaigns. Because if you trust Twitter and Facebook to only publish that which is legit, then it's a matter of who spends the most for their PSYOP campaigns.
Well, what I would say to that is, I think this is somewhat demonstrated in the data, as the social media companies, and it's still early days, mind you, but as the social media companies implement counter-propaganda strategies of their own accord and without government oversight, what you find is that the audiences that feel most put down by that silo themselves elsewhere. So we found that a lot of the alt-right movement has decided to move itself off of Twitter and go to gab.ai.
Yeah.
And the hacking community has decided to move a lot of its discussion from, and the cybersecurity community as well, move a lot of their discussions from Twitter, where it may be received or you get unjustly blocked and banned from Twitter. You see those communities are siloing on IRC or on the Slack chats out there.
I've seen a lot of people moving to Mastodon recently as well.
Yeah,
I'm on
Mastodon
Mastodon.
as well.
Yeah, Mastodon and Discord.
Yeah, and Discord as well. So there is a chance that as the social media companies implement their own terms of service, that there will be some level of. So I see it more as the target audiences will start siloing themselves, and that would be how targeting is easier. It's going to be much harder for any independent observer to figure out what sort of propaganda is being disseminated on the Gab AIs or the Discords or whatever of the world. But that's sort of a problem for the intelligence community and for whomever is deciding that they want to tip their hand and try to monitor this stuff. Honestly, if there's nobody on Twitter that supports the alt-right position, then any messaging supporting the alt-right position is not likely to resonate with any target audience on Twitter. So you won't see too much messaging of that sort. Again, it's early days, and I'm willing to be wrong about that in 5 years, but that's what we've got so far. Any more? Very good. I'll be around for the remainder of the day, so come say hi. Thank you.